Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. No need to be scared. I think what we'll talk about will be quite human. We're talking today about better life and how that leads to better performance. My name is Anastina Hintsa. I'm the CEO of Hintsa Performance. I'm also an entrepreneur in second generation. I'm an ex-consultant, and yes, an ultramarathon runner. I was the first Finn to complete the 4 Deserts Ultramarathon series. I'm also a mother to the most amazing 3-year-old little boy, which means that right now, standing here, I'm chronically sleep deprived. We'll talk about 4 things today. We'll start by setting the scene. We'll talk about what does it take for a Formula One driver, but also for us all, to thrive under pressure. We'll talk about what does it take to sustain that performance over a long term. And then finally, I want to touch on stress. But let's start by setting the scene. This image is something that deeply resonates with me. I became the CEO of Hintsa in 2019, late 2019. So I was about 4 or 5 months into my tenure when COVID hit. And since then, it has felt like you get your head above the water, and there's the next wave crushing in. And I think that feeling is shared by a lot of people in this room. We have about 60% of executives who feel used up by the end of their workday. That's a strong indicator of burnout. At Hintsa, our job is to help individuals live a better life, and as a consequence, perform better. The company was founded by my father, Dr. Ake Hintsa, who started working with long-distance runners in Ethiopia in the early 1990s. He would then go on to work in Formula One since 1996 and develop this method that has since then helped 18 world championships and 96% of podium places in Formula One over the last decade. It's like our human test laboratory. And there are surprisingly many parallels to business. The method itself is pretty simple. Better life leads to better performance. It's a prerequisite. It's not something you do on the side. It consists of 6 different elements on the outer circle: physical activity, nutrition, mental energy, biomechanics, sleep and recovery, general health. They're all interconnected. At the inside of that circle, you have your identity, your sense of purpose, and your sense of control. And on the outside, no man is an island. You have your relationships. The way we show up has a cascading impact on those around us. So a pretty simple method. Why is it relevant for business? 4 things. Productivity, getting stuff done. People with high well-being are almost 20% more productive than those with poor well-being. That's like an extra workday. Effectiveness, the quality of our output suffers when we're sleep deprived, lacking exercise, in a poor state. I'll talk more about that later. We talk about creativity and innovation, novel ideas, 4 to 6 times more novel ideas when walking, 2.4 times more likely to solve a complex problem after a good night's sleep. And then finally, my favorite, collaboration. We know that when we're sleep deprived, when we are chronically stressed, our ability to recognize micro-emotions in other people's faces and our ability to regulate our own goes down. We become less empathetic, less able to collaborate. All of these, by the way, I would argue, are key skills, especially right now that our work and our life are fundamentally changing. The challenge, of course, is this. We have this crazy ideal of a relaxed superhuman. We want to be top performers at work. At the same time, we go home and we want to be the best parent and the perfect spouse. faithful friend. We have these crazy hobbies. We're learning, I don't know, Mandarin or Python or doing that AI course in your free time. It doesn't take an expert to tell you that this equation, doing all of this, is unsustainable. What my father, Dr. Akehinsa, would have told you is this. Ask yourself, what does success, not just at work, but in life, what does success really look like for you? What does it really mean to you? Before you start searching for it in the wrong places. Because trust me, you will face trade-offs. In fact, one could even argue that trade-offs are a core leadership skill. Managing those trade-offs is a part of what we do. Conflicting, interrelated goals. Profit versus purpose. Cooperation versus competition. Efficiency versus change. We know this. One of those trade-offs, or paradoxes, is around well-being and performance. And I encourage you to think about it. What are some concrete well-being and performance trade-offs that you have recently encountered? Staying up late to finish that presentation? Going out for that work dinner or home to your spouse? They accumulate. The key is to become conscious of those choices as opposed to something that just happens. Now, I promised we would talk a little bit about Formula One and getting in that car. What does it take for a driver to perform at that peak performance moment? Now, how many of you recognize that thing on the left? Yeah? Maybe? It's a Formula One steering wheel. It's pretty complex. It's got 35 buttons on it. I want you, for a minute, to get in that car. It's pretty uncomfortable. You're pretty cramped in that cockpit. In the Singapore race, where the degrees outside are like 40 Celsius, in the cockpit, you get up to 60. A driver will sweat 3 to 4 kilos of their body weight during a 2-hour race. They're driving at 240 kilometers per hour. You got 19 other cars on the track, and you're constantly multitasking and making split-second decisions on that wheel. It's a pretty high-pressure job. Outside that circuit, you're constantly managing multiple stakeholders. You got your team, you got your manager, you got the media, you got your fans, you got your dad, you got your girlfriend, etc. You have extreme external pressure for your team, for your job, for your life, and you have an internal pressure to perform. Are you in the right set of mind? Getting in the car? I'm going to give you a test. I'll show you a super quick image, and I want you to internalize as much as you can. It's a split second. You ready? What did you see? Yeah. How many of you spotted the corner? Okay. How many of you realized there was a decision to make? Maybe? Did you recognize the place? I have to ask this since we're in Austria. Maybe. Yeah, good. Well done. So here we are. What you saw from that cockpit is, yes, I can't actually see it myself, but you will see there's a lockup on the right side. Somebody's braking. You see a decision that you're about to make. Which car do you follow? Which driving line do you take? And the corner, that's in the right-hand side. I'll show you very briefly what the driver actually did. It's not this. It's start of the race, so super important. He's getting to that corner. You see the lockup over there. He actually pulls back to get forward. Super experienced driver, that's Massa. He knows what he's doing. Soon you'll see him actually repeat the same move, kinda. Getting it into the next corner. You'll see him do it again. And they do it again. And they do it again. The reason I wanted to show you this was not just to test how alert you are. I want to ask you this. How did that make you feel? How many of you felt stressed? Quite a few hands up. Relaxed? I don't see many hands. Focused? Yeah, a couple of hands in the back. You'll see there's a spectrum of ways that this will make you feel. One of the key things we work with our drivers on is regulation, self-regulation, self-awareness. Knowing where you are on that arousal versus performance curve. You don't want to be too relaxed getting in that car. You also don't want to be overstimulated and anxious, because that will increase your error rate. You want to hit that sweet spot of focus and flow. You'll also notice that we differentiate between a clutch state, so that's like really intense, deliberate focus, but you feel the stress, and flow, where you have this optimal balance between challenge and skill. It's a complex task you're performing, but you know how to do it. You feel good. You're in flow. Interestingly, by the way, research suggests that we have a higher chance of experiencing flow at work than in our free time. What does this mean in practice? We need to identify what kind of drivers you are. For some drivers, we need to upregulate them before the race. They're a little bit too relaxed, too cocky getting in there. So what we do is we try and stimulate them. You might use activities for high arousal exercise. You will use caffeine, maybe, aggressive music. And the opposite for the guys who are a little bit too overstimulated, a twitchy, anxious getting in there. We do something calming, yoga, breath exercises. We focus on the accuracy in the cognitive reaction tasks. And we limit the caffeine and Rammstein or whatever you do to do aggressive music. The key for you from all this is this. Do you know what your first corners are? Have you identified the key performance moments? An important meeting? I don't know, an exit discussion with a colleague? What are your first corners? And what's your race day routine? How do you prepare for them? And how do you sustain that performance? The next question. A Formula One driver is on the road for 240 days per year. The schedule is not made for human performance, it's made for TV rights. How do you sustain that performance over the long term? I want to talk about recovery. And yes, many of us have funny notions about recovery. We still, after all these years, we think of it a little bit as a luxury. For an athlete, recovery is part of their job. And there is no better way to demonstrate this than the concept of supercompensation. How many of you have heard of this? Okay. So supercompensation is when true recovery, true development happens. When we train, we actually break muscle tissue. And it is only during recovery that we develop and end up at a level above our starting point. That difference is called supercompensation. The same applies to our work. We need that recovery period in order to actually develop. And what happens if that recovery period is too short or inefficient? We end up in a downward-facing spiral. We really need that recovery. There is some really exciting new research around this too. In 2020, they found that factors affecting your cognitive lifespan, cognitive performance across your lifespan. This graph is a little bit difficult to read, but on the top, in red, you have things that are your risk factors. On the bottom, you have protective factors. You'll recognize things such as use it or lose it, a protective factor. Your nutrition, another key protective factor. staying strong, physical exercise, a protective factor not just for your health, but for your cognition. And then finally, if you go to the top, the worst thing up there is something called the cerebral microbleed. Pretty bad, increases chance of stroke. The second biggest risk factor is sleep disturbance. Your sleep has a massive impact on your cognition. And I personally really like this study to show you why. It's a seminal study by Van Dogen et al., where they looked at 4 groups of people for 2 weeks. One group slept for 8 hours per night, another one for 6, one for 4, and then there was this poor group that had to stay up for 2 nights in a row. Then they measured their cognitive performance during that period of time. Any guesses of what happened? Our cognitive performance declines with sleep debt. Sleep debt is cumulative, and it impairs our cognition. What I want you to pay attention to is the group that was sleeping for 6 hours per night. What you will realize is that by the end of the 2-week period, their performance decline was equivalent to staying up for 2 nights in a row. For every single person sleeping 6 hours per night in this room on a regular basis, that's a pretty shocking thing. And you will probably tell me, isn't this individual? The second key finding from the same study was this: we don't notice the decline. We get used to it. After a few days, we get used to performing suboptimally. When we think about it, it all makes sense. We sleep in 90-minute cycles, alternating between REM and non-REM sleep. What you may not realize is that those cycles are not identical. Towards the end of our night, we get more REM sleep, more brain recovery time. And if we lose that, we lose up to 40% of our memory consolidation and learning. That's pretty dramatic. So please get the 8 hours. Number 1, quantity. Number 2, consistency. Your kids have a consistent bedtime, so should you. They also found that sleep debt, if variable, has a worst effect. So if you're consistently switching the time you go to bed and the time you wake up, it has a worse impact on your performance than if you went to bed at the same time all the time, even if you got less sleep. Quantity, consistency, and quality. I won't go into the last piece right now. Instead, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and we'll talk about daytime recovery for just 1 second. On the right-hand side, you see a Formula One schedule. That's a qualifying day. And it's pretty small print, so I don't expect you to read it. What I want you to realize or notice from there is you have a couple of different elements. You have high gear movements. You have quite a lot of black. That's recovery time. Low gear. And then you have medium gear. What happens in our lives often is that our days are more blue, more on the medium gear side. We don't get enough of the black stuff of their low gear recovery time, which means that when we should be switching to high gear for that first corner, for that high performance moment, we get stuck in middle gear. We don't have the resources. Ericsson concluded that we only have the ability to focus for 1 hour at a time, 4 hours per day. I'm not advocating a 4-hour workday, but I'm telling you, if you have 4 high-performance, high-focus hours per day, know where they are and protect them. It will also depend on things such as your chronotype. Are you a morning type or an evening type? Will have an impact on your cognition, on your creativity, even on how ethical the decisions that you make are. They studied that with bankers. Key to remember from this, know your chronotype. You get 4 hours, protect them. and try to include as many breaks as you can, especially around the midday. In a team setting, I know it's more difficult. You might not be able to actually schedule and plan your day. But having that awareness across yourself and your team members can be a first step for better performance. Final piece, reframing stress. How many of you think a Formula One driver is stressed when they get in the car? Few hands up. Good. Yes, they are. Otherwise, they would be dead. Stress is neutral. It's the instinctive response pattern that helps us escape lions, gives us the mental and physical resources to rise to the challenge. A normal stress response looks something like this. We activate our parasympathetic nervous system. We escape from the lion. We get in the car. We meet our boss. We get our toddler to get their clothes on in the morning. When the stressor is gone, we relax. We activate our parasympathetic nervous system. We come back to our baseline. We replenish our resources. Now, the challenges start when stress becomes chronic. How many of you have watched those nature documentaries? Do you remember the ones where you have the gazelles and antelopes and a lion comes and chases them? And then the antelope escapes. And then they go back to grazing and they shake it off and then they go back to grazing again. That's the normal stress response. For us humans, what would happen is we see the lion, we escape. And then we start thinking, where did the lion come from? Why did it attack me? Why didn't I see it before? We get into that rumination loop. The stress becomes chronic. We never recover, we never get back to our baseline. It's like that negative supercompensation curve. We got 3 responses to physiological stress. Fight, flight, freeze, our default. A challenge. Instead of thinking of stress as negative, thinking of it as a challenge. And then finally, one of my favorites, tend to befriend. When stressed, we often have this idea of isolating, hunking down and doing our thing, when in fact what we should do, a key component of resilient individuals, is they reach out for support and help. We're not looking for absence of stress, we're looking for optimal stress. We want to get in that stretch zone so that we challenge ourselves. But if we want to develop, we also need to pendle back into comfort so that we recover and replenish our resources. If we spend too long in the stretch, it will eventually become strain, and that strain will become crisis. I went through a burnout myself early in my career. I was 9 months into a managing consultant, and one day, running down the stairs, I fainted. I woke up at the bottom, blood in my hair, and my first reaction was to search for my laptop. Yeah, it was a pretty embarrassing moment. I realized something had to change. Burnout has 3 central symptoms: exhaustion, mental and physical. You're too tired to get up in the morning. You're also too tired to stop working at the night. Cynicism. Any novel idea, our immediate reaction is no, can't do it. Cognitive load is too high. And inefficacy. Eventually we start doubting our skills, doubting our professional efficiency. But burnout is not sudden. Our bodies will try to warn us. We have these stress tells, like Harry Potter's scar. They can be physical, they can be behavioral. I know I pull my hair. They can be emotional. We become more irritable. Anyone? Yeah, exactly. And they can be cognitive. It becomes too difficult to prioritize, which leads to a vicious curve. It's important that you recognize your stress tells, but it's also important that you share them. Because oftentimes, our biggest strength, our ability to focus, our resilience, our stamina, becomes our weakness. We don't realize when we've gone too far, but others might. Good news is, there is ways to break that. Science talks of 4 elements of recovery, of mental recovery. Relaxation, Netflix and chill. Mastery, instead of watching Queen's Gambit, maybe play chess. Detachment. Creating a barrier between your work and your free time. For me, it's when I open my home door, I ask myself the question, who is the person I want to be behind this door? And then finally, control. How often during your week do you actually have times when you decide for yourself how you spend your free time? In the business context, it's this. Demands will be high, but you have things you can do. You have levers you can pull. Dangerous work happens when your demands are high, but your support and your control are also low. However, when demands are high, ask yourself, is there a way for me to increase the level of control and flexibility for the individual? Is there a way for me to increase the level of support? And is there a way for me to connect what they're doing, connect the challenging task better to a sense of meaning and purpose? You'll be glad to know this is the last slide. Super quick recap. Better life leads to better performance. Know your first corner. Know your race day routine. Recovery is when true development happens. And then finally, we're looking for optimal stress, not the absence of stress. Thank you very much.